In the late 19th century, the Arctic still held a strange power over the human imagination. It was one of the last great blank spaces on the map, a place where science, ambition, pride, and fantasy all blended together. Many people believed that somewhere beyond the ring of crushing sea ice, there might be an open polar ocean, a hidden navigable sea that would allow a determined expedition to sail all the way to the North Pole. It was an idea that felt almost magical, and in an age obsessed with exploration, it was powerful enough to send men straight into one of the harshest environments on Earth. One of the expeditions driven by that belief was the journey of the USS Jeannette. The ship was sent north under the command of George Washington DeLong, a U.S. Navy officer chosen to lead a bold attempt to reach deep into the Arctic through the Bering Strait. The mission had money, attention, scientific goals, and the confidence of an era that believed determination and planning could overcome almost anything. The Jeannette left San Francisco in 1879 with a crew of 33 men, loaded with supplies, scientific instruments, and the hope that they were heading toward discovery rather than disaster. At first, the voyage still had the shape of a classic exploration story. The crew pushed northward into remote waters, expecting resistance, but also expecting progress. What they found instead was the brutal reality of the Arctic. By September of that year, the Jeannette became trapped in pack ice near Wrangel Island. The ship was no longer sailing under its own control. It had become a prisoner, locked in a field of moving ice and carried wherever the polar forces decided to take it. That moment changed everything. The expedition had set out to conquer distance, but now it was being held in place by something larger and far more patient than any human plan. The men could not simply turn around and go home. They could only endure. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the Jeannette drifted with the ice. The world around the crew narrowed into pressure ridges, bitter wind, darkness, cold, and the endless groaning of the frozen sea pressing against the hull. Life aboard the trapped vessel became a test of discipline as much as survival. The crew had to maintain order in a place where time itself seemed to stop. They took observations, cared for equipment, rationed supplies, and performed duties that must sometimes have felt almost absurd because routine was one of the few things standing between them and psychological collapse. In an ordinary voyage, a ship is movement, agency, direction. In the Arctic, the Jeannette became something else entirely. It was a wooden shelter surrounded by a white prison, and every sound in the ice carried the threat of death. The ice was never still. It shifted, pressed, cracked, and piled up with unimaginable force. At times, it squeezed the ship so violently that the timbers groaned under the strain. In January 1880, the pressure became severe enough to breach the hull, and freezing water began pouring into the vessel. It was a terrifying warning of what was coming. Men fought to save the ship, forcing themselves into freezing conditions to plug leaks and hold disaster back for a little longer. Their efforts succeeded for the moment, but the message was clear. The Arctic was not loosening its grip. It was tightening it. Still, the Jeannette survived. Or at least, it continued to float. The months dragged on. The men stayed trapped through one Arctic winter and then another. Imagine the mental strain of that existence. The same frozen horizon, the same uncertainty, the same knowledge that every day survived did not necessarily bring rescue any closer. There is something uniquely cruel about a disaster that unfolds slowly. A storm is terror, but drift is erosion. It wears down courage grain by grain. The crew of the Jeannette had to live not only with fear, but with duration. Then, in June 1881, the long threat finally became final reality. The ice crushed the Jeannette beyond hope of repair. The hull gave way under the pressure, and DeLong ordered the ship abandoned. In the early hours, the men watched their vessel sink into the Arctic Ocean. It must have been an almost unreal sight. For 2 years, the ship had been their world, their refuge, their structure, the one barrier between themselves and the polar wasteland. Now, it was gone. They were hundreds of miles from Siberia, standing on ice, with 3 small boats, salvaged supplies, and almost no margin for error. That was the beginning of the second ordeal. Once the ship sank, the survivors had to transform themselves from sailors into something closer to human draft animals. They dragged boats, sledges, food, instruments, and records across the frozen ocean, hauling everything over ridges of broken ice and across unstable surfaces that could crack or flood beneath them. Nothing came easily. A short distance on a map could take endless labor in reality. They would strain forward for hours, only to find their progress stolen by the drift of the ice beneath them. The Arctic did not merely force them to work. It made that work feel almost futile. The men were exhausted, but they could not afford to move carelessly. Every calorie mattered, every decision mattered. They had to think constantly about what to carry, what to conserve, how to move, when to stop, how much strength to spend. The burden was not just physical, it was mental. To survive in those conditions, they had to keep believing that the next stage might save them. If they could only reach open water, maybe they could use the boats. If they could use the boats, maybe they could reach land. If they could reach land, maybe help would still be possible. Eventually, after weeks of hauling themselves and their equipment across the ice, they did reach open water. The boats were launched, and the men turned south toward Siberia. On paper, this looked like progress. In reality, they were now in small open craft on Arctic seas, weakened by everything they had already endured. The danger had changed form, but not intensity. Instead of pressure ridges and frozen drift, they faced cold spray, unstable water, exposure, and the possibility that one storm could destroy them. That storm came. A violent gale scattered the 3 boats and tore the expedition apart. One of the boats vanished and was lost with the men aboard. The survivors in the other boats had no way of knowing who was alive, who was dead, or whether any part of the expedition would ever come together again. By this point, the Jeannette story had become a chain of disasters, each one arriving before the last had fully ended. The crew had lost the ship, survived the ice, reached the sea, and then been broken apart by the weather just when land seemed closest. One of the surviving boats was commanded by Chief Engineer George Melville. His group was fortunate enough to reach people in the Lena Delta region who gave them food, shelter, and warmth. After everything they had endured, that contact with human kindness must have felt almost unreal. But even with safety in sight, the ordeal was not emotionally over. Melville knew that DeLong and the others were still missing somewhere in the Siberian wilderness, and he refused to leave the story there. DeLong's group had reached land too, but not safety. They came ashore in a bleak, desolate stretch of the Lena Delta, with almost no food left and almost no strength to spare. This final phase of the story is perhaps the most haunting, because there is no dramatic shipwreck at its center, no violent battle against a visible enemy. There is only attrition, hunger, cold, mud, distance. One by one, the men weakened. Every movement took more effort than they had left to give. They tried to keep going inland, hoping to find help, but the landscape itself seemed designed to grind them down. The food ran out. Bodies began to fail. DeLong, faced with an impossible situation, eventually sent 2 of the strongest men ahead in the hope that they could find assistance. He stayed behind with the weaker members of the party rather than abandoning them. It was a choice that said everything about the nature of the final days. There were no good options left, only degrees of loyalty and despair. As the party weakened, death stopped being a dramatic interruption and became a steady presence. Men collapsed and could not rise again. Their strength was gone, consumed by months and then years of exposure, work, fear, and hunger. What makes this section of the Jeannette story so devastating is that these were not men who failed quickly. They had already survived more than most people could imagine. Their deaths came at the far end of endurance. Meanwhile, Melville organized search efforts. Though he had barely survived himself, he pushed back into the Siberian wilderness looking for DeLong and the missing men. That determination became one of the great acts of loyalty in the whole tragedy. He could have accepted survival and left the dead to the Arctic. Instead, he went back. He searched through a landscape that had already swallowed ships, boats, and entire parties of men. In the spring of 1882, Melville's search party finally found DeLong and his companions. They were dead, frozen where they had made their last stand against the cold and starvation. It was the end of the expedition in the most somber sense possible. Yet even there, even at the edge of complete failure, something remained of the discipline that had carried the men so far. Records and notes survived with DeLong's body, preserving the final chapter of the expedition. Even while dying, the men had continued to document, to observe, to leave behind an account of what had happened. In the end, 20 of the 33 men who had sailed from San Francisco died. The Jeannette expedition failed in its original purpose. It did not discover an easy path to the pole. It did not prove the dream of a warm, open polar sea. Instead, it shattered those assumptions. The Arctic revealed itself not as a hidden route to glory, but as a place of crushing force, false hope, and relentless attrition. And yet, that is not the whole story. The Jeannette disaster also became part of the history of polar knowledge. The drifting of the trapped ship, the records preserved by the crew, and the hard facts pulled from the expedition helped future explorers understand Arctic ice movement more clearly. The men had gone north chasing theory, and in the end their suffering helped replace fantasy with reality. What lingers most about the Jeannette is not just the scale of the loss, but the shape of it. This was not a single moment of catastrophe. It was a long stripping away of confidence, comfort, tools, and illusions. First, the ship lost freedom. Then the crew lost the ship. Then they lost the security of the ice. Then they lost one another in the storm. Then, on land, they lost even the basic certainty that walking forward would lead anywhere at all. George Washington DeLong did not return as a triumphant conqueror of the North. Instead, he became the central figure in one of the most punishing survival stories in Arctic history. His men were not destroyed by one bad decision or one sudden accident alone. They were destroyed by a world so vast, cold, and indifferent that every small mistake, every false theory, and every delay became magnified into catastrophe. That is why the story endures. It is not only a tale of exploration, it is a tale of endurance after the mission itself has already failed. It is about what human beings do when the goal that sent them forward disappears, and only survival remains. The Jeannette sailed north on ambition, confidence, and belief. In the end, what remained was hunger, ice, loyalty, discipline, and the stubborn refusal of a few exhausted men to stop moving even when the world around them had already decided otherwise.